Good afternoon. I'm starting thanking you for being in our session. That will be, as we already been said, it's already been said, how are we prepared to cover a future pandemic? And I say we have made on a Portuguese health insurer. Let me start by presenting the team. We are four, coming from Portugal, which is on the other side of the world, that made it impossible to gather all the team here today. So, at least we can say Maria's came, although you can imagine it wasn't the criteria. We are now, I hope, moving, yes. So our presentation will be divided in three parts. The first one, I will try to explain how was our COVID experience in our country and in our company. Then Maria will explain maybe the most interesting for you as it covers the pandemic risk modulation. And at the end, we will share some few reflections and concluding remarks. So, as I said, Portugal is a small country with a population around 10 million. The national health expenses around 20 million. In 2021 was 24 million, which represents 11% of the GDP. As you can see on the chart pie below here, we have a strong national health system that funded 67% of the bill. Then the second financier are the individuals and their families with 28% of the bills, and the private sector of insurers represents only 3% and are the third financier. To fully understand what happened in Portugal, we must go back into history. So let me start by explaining you that in 1965 we had a huge mortality change for child. So it was 65 per thousand. At the time, in 1965, the government implemented a compulsory vaccination plan that allowed us to decrease significantly the childhood mortality rate. So in 2020, the childhood mortality rate was 2.5 per thousand, even including the over-mortality that we know it happened during the COVID. At the middle, we have the map of Portugal, at least the continental part of Portugal, and in dark red, we see the spots where we observed more incidents and that match with the most populated regions. In order to compare our figures and our experience with the rest of the world, we brought the mortality rate and the incidence rate. As you can see, if you look at the mortality rate, we have a high incidence rate, around 18.2%, against the 11% in Europe, all Europe, including Portugal, and all the wild 3.3%. If we speak about death mortality rate, what we can see is exactly the opposite. Portugal has the lowest mortality rate than the Europe and wild world. We believe this is linked to our experience with vaccination, and at the middle of the period, 3 years period of pandemic, it was at the end of September 2025, 85% of the population had already shot 2 vaccines. We believe it's linked with the good experience. Talking about the Multicare, which is the company where we made our essay, let me just explain one thing. In Portugal, the health policy exclude pandemics. So, what happened in Portugal? First, I'll present Multicare, which is the leader of the health market. We had in 2020 38% of quota share. The second player had 25%, and all the other competitors some 37% of the quota share in the health insurance markets. What happened in Portugal? During the lockdown, the health minister would go to the TV news every day at noon to inform the public of the COVID statistics. We are talking about the number of infected people in each day, the number of infected people by age and gender, the number of hospitalizations within ICU or in the sick bay, and the number of deaths. As you can imagine, it were statistics day by day, and without the movement, we don't know on the second day which are the new infections, which died. We only have photographies in each day. So, in the middle of April, the number of infected people was growing so fast, then people start to looking for private medical cares. And the health minister came to TV to announce that the national health system would only pay for private care if the person was referred for them. At the same day, the Association of Portuguese Insurers and the Association of Portuguese Private Hospitals start negotiations fixing prices for hospitalization with and without ICU. On the second day, after, our board asked us to do a high-level estimation about what it will be the cost for multicare if you wanted to stand by their own clients in hospitalizations. We had only these numbers that I already told you, and we had 10 hours to do it. We did it, and that's really the moment when this project took off. The next day, the company could announce to the market that we would pay the hospitalizations and the COVID tests. We were the first player paying COVID tests. We were the unique player paying hospitalizations and further on post-COVID checkups that we developed with our clinical department. And like the others, we paid the individual protection equipment. All those costs in these 3 years represented an additive and an extra cost of 16% of a regular claims cost in our company. So now that I think I could present to you what happened in Portugal and what is the situation of multicare in Portugal, I'll invite Maria to come and explain how we modeled the pandemic risk. Thank you.
Hello, I'm the other Maria, the youngest one. And as Maria do Carmo said, the question we had to answer was, are we prepared to cover a future pandemic, or are multicare prepared to cover a future pandemic, since we were using multicare data and portfolio? In order to give an answer to that question, we divided the project in 4 parts. We started by 2, and then we decided to study a little more and do the other 2. So we started by estimating the annual costs of the first year of pandemics using COVID-19 as a reference. In the second part, we evaluate quite extreme situations because it is quite impossible to predict the characteristics of the future pandemics. And then we study the impact on costs for the duration of pandemics. And in the end, we try to predict the time until the next pandemic. So, to estimate the annual cost, we assume that all multicare clients use their health insurance to cover COVID-19 hospitalizations and other pandemic variables. We consider as pandemic variables also IPEs and PCR tests. At this point, we didn't consider checkups as a pandemic variable cost because we didn't have enough information about it and we could study. For PCR tests, we assumed a constant value, which was the amount Multicare paid in the first year of pandemic. But the same approach was not possible for PCR tests and hospitalizations, since these two costs were practically supported by our national system, and we didn't know how many of our clients were infected or needed to be hospitalized. So we use Portuguese data to see the behavior of the costs of tests, and it found to be proportional to the number of infections. And the cost of hospitalizations is the sum of hospitalizations in the ICU and in the sick bay. But as I already said, we didn't know which of Multicare clients had been infected or hospitalized, so we need to start by estimating these two numbers in order to get an annual cost, or estimation annual cost for this first year of COVID-19. We assume that all policyholders could test positive for COVID-19 more than one time, and therefore using incidences by age, sex, and region, and probabilities of getting hospitalized by age and sex, because our national system didn't release this data by region. We only have hospitalizations by age and sex. We applied these incidence and probability in our portfolio, and we get the number of cases and hospitalizations per month. But at this point, a new question arises as to whether the private hospitals will have the capacity for all Multicare clients who need to be admitted at the hospital. We didn't know if the private hospitals have enough space for all our clients. So the cost of hospitalizations would be overestimated. For that reason, and we think it is a very conservative estimation, we assume that a maximum of 30% of health private sector beds are available to pandemic-related hospitalizations to Multicare clients. And in this way, we had to confirm how many of the hospitalizations that we had previously estimated were actually going to be paid for by the company. For this, we made a simulation process using the distributions of length of stay at the hospital and the number of beds occupied and available at each moment. And to model the distributions of loss, we used a sample of more than 2,000 of patients from a Portuguese public hospital and created two groups of patients, those who do not stay at ICU, which have only loss at the sick bay, and those who stay at ICU, which have loss at the sick bay and in the ICU. Of those two groups of patients, we created 3 samples of loss, as I said, and we also test if we can group the losses in the sick bay in the same sample, but we reject the null hypothesis, so we really need to adjust 3 different distributions. Loss distributions are positively skewed because only a few patients have long loss. Therefore, we adjusted Weibull, log normal, and gamma distributions and performed 4 tests to help us decide which distribution best fits to our data. We said that for a distribution to be accepted, it must not be rejected in 2 or more tests, and we also observed the histogram and curve of fit. Thus, we can state that loss at the hospital for patients who do not need ICU treatments follows a log normal distribution, and loss at the sick bay and loss at ICU for those patients who need ICU treatments follow Weibull distributions. But I should confess that there is not much difference on using gamma or variable distribution, but we didn't have enough evidence to exclude one of them, so we used the one most used in literature, which is Weibull. For each patient, depending on the type of hospitalization, we generated the loss or losses, and we saw if there were any beds available at the time of the admission. And from the observation of the graph, the graph, we can see that only in January 2021, the company wouldn't pay for all hospital expenses of its consumers. And by now, we have been able to know how many cases and hospitalizations Multicare would have in its portfolio, and estimate the costs of the pandemic in the first year of COVID-19. And from now on, I will call this scenario as reference scenario. As I said in the beginning, in the second part, we evaluate extreme situations because it is quite impossible to predict the characteristics of a future pandemic. We used the same approach I explained for the reference scenario. We started to study the incidences of European countries which have more cases per million than Portugal, which are Czechia and Slovenia. Then we changed some assumptions, like as considering higher hospitalization rates or an elderly population. This last because we are expecting that the portfolio to get older, since this behavior is expected to occur in Portugal, and also because the permanence limit in health insurance has already been removed. And to conclude, we performed tests with the worst characteristics of other pandemics like measles, SARS, and MERS-CoV. As we can see in the table, in the reference scenario, pandemic costs represents 40% of all other claims in a year without pandemic, while in the worst case, which is the worst combination of all scenarios, it means an addition of 72% of all claim costs. After that, we can say that the costs with a pandemic can vary depending on the severity of the illness. And if Multicare wants to be with its clients in times of pandemics, it is cautious to have an extra premium to support these costs. After all being said, we felt that there were still two important points to calculate a premium. There are the behavior of the costs in the year following the first one and the time until the next pandemic. To study the impact of a pandemic duration, we check whether the product between the cost of a pandemic year and the duration of an active disease would underestimate the costs of a pandemic duration. And we actually conclude that the years after the first one have lower costs, certainly due to vaccination, and this behavior is expected to continue or even decrease because there are already many lessons learned, such as approvals, mass productions, and distributions. The time between pandemics has been decreasing due to climate change, urbanization, and globalization. And this was probably the most difficult part of our project. There is almost nothing literature on this. We started by using Poisson process, but not all models' assumptions are satisfied. As I said, the time between pandemics is decreasing, and in Poisson process, increments should be stationary, which means that the number of pandemics in an interval depends only on the length of the interval and not on where the interval occurs. But anyway, with this methodology, we get 18 years until the next pandemic. And Bill Gates said that a new pandemic will occur in 20 years, so we are closer. But at this point, a new paper was published, which I invite you to read if you are interested in this topic, because they are the experts on that, I'm not, where they use extreme value theory, which is a methodology that tries to provide the best possible estimate of tail distributions. It provides statistical techniques to study extreme or rare events. And we use two methods. the block maxima, which models extremes using the limit distributions of the maximums, and peak over thresholds, which models extremes using the distributions of excess above a certain level. And the main difference between the two of them is that POT uses the highest observations, while block maxima uses the maximums on each period. Despite knowing that there is a big error associated, we obtain that a next pandemic will occur within 12 to 13 years. And I now invite Maria do Carmo to join me in concluding remarks. Thank you.
So, as a concluding remarks, I think one of them, all of us have the same idea. The question is not if a new pandemic will come, but when. The impact of the new pandemic, it will depend on each country context. And it will be always a big challenge to delivery and financing the health care, but we think in each country will depend in 4 main factors. The first one is the capacity of the country to do quickly adaptation in terms of economics, political, or social. The second main factor is how strong is the national health system in each country. The third is the risk absorption capacity of the insurer and reinsurers working on the market. And at last, but maybe the most important one, which virus will come and how harmful it could be for human beings. Thank you very much, and we'll let you know that we have the bibliography that we used for this study. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just wondering when so 12 years from now is 2035, so I'm not sure where the International Congress is going to be that year, or 2041, but they make sure they've got good contingency plans for next pandemic, if that's happening. So thank you, team, for the really good presentation. So we've obviously got the Q&A open, so if you do have any questions, you can put them in there, or if we've also got a roving mic for questions from the floor. But just while we're waiting for those to come through, you mentioned in your presentation about you've done some pricing, premium and product work for, a potential product solution for sort of pandemic coverage. Did you want to just talk a little bit about where that got to and, where that's at?
Okay, sure. It's working? Yes. Yes, we already create in terms of design the product a new coverage, a specific pandemic coverage that we thought we could launch in 2022 or somewhere in 2023 at this starting from the moment that WHO will claim the end of the pandemic. This happened earlier this month. But 2 things appear that became a challenge for us. The first one is the war in Ukraine that brought us an inflation issue that in the last few years it wasn't part of our concerns. And the second one is the IFRS 17, that doesn't allow to have a provision with a duration greater than the contract duration. And we think, like in earthquakes risks, we should have a provision that will create, because we are not sure if the new pandemic, it will happen in 12, in 18, or more. So the company should have a provision, a special provision, and we couldn't find yet the solution to do it.
Any questions from the floor? Might just ask ask another one. What about the Portuguese government? Like, what's been their sort of involvement or response to the work that you've been doing? Have they taken an interest, just generally, in terms of the way the insurance industry is responding?
As we work at it's working? Yes. As we work at a private insurer, we only discuss this inside the company. So I really don't know what government think about it. I think they expect to keep on with a strong national health system. But what we saw in Portugal is the growing of private health care providers, okay? And they are taking from the public national health system the physicians and the enfermeiros, how do you say it? The nurses. Okay, thank you. 5 minutes.
Any other questions? Or not from myself, but just maybe got a mic. Just hang on a tick. There you go.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you experience a reduction in other claims, and how much did that offset?
Yes, it was a very big reduction in April 2020 because the lockdown started March 16th, and everybody went home, and the big hospitals became empty, almost empty, only COVID person and in national health system, not the private ones. But what happened the years later was the diagnosis of other diseases will happen later, and the status of the disease became more dangerous. It's not a term, but I'm sorry about my English.
And the costs were bigger the years of the pandemic.
And they are still growing.
So they compensate the lower costs we have in the pandemic years.
Just to, yep, maybe go there. There's a question on the app. Just building on that one, would you expect the future pandemics, the impact to be any different in terms of the reduction in the claims? Like, is there anything in your research that points to that?
I think it depends on the virus, on the demanding the new pandemic will bring. If we have a high contagious virus, we should lock down again, and people will go home and won't use the hospitals unless they are in an urgent situation.
Thank you for your presentation. I was just curious, with the analysis that you've done, have you concluded how you will price and or reserve for this future pandemic that is coming much sooner than we previously would have anticipated? And how is that reflected in your financial reporting?
I think the reason we didn't launch the cover, it was exactly the need we felt about having the provision. What we would like to have is to demand some additional premium for the new coverage and becoming a provision that will pass here through here till the day the pandemics will come. But we don't know yet if it will be possible. So although one possibility it will be with the reinsurer, because we also could, we had negotiated with a big reinsurer the coverage, okay? But it was a little bit expensive, as I can imagine. And the board said, no, not yet. We must study the possibility of having that provision.
Great. Well, I think that pretty much takes us to time. So Thank you, Maria and Maria, for speaking.